We're reading from the Gospel of Luke this Sunday, but the Old Testament lessons would have been from the first book of Kings. Sort of as close as we might come to some history books in the Old Testament, Kings and Chronicles. But the lessons in Kings had to do with the Temple of Solomon, when it was built, the great temple and everything. And a lot of those, the verses in those chapters, they tell about every little, ornament and everything. Boring. But it really was a kind of neat Old Testament lesson for today, because when it was dedicated, the king and also the prophet remembered to pray to God about the foreigners who would come there to ask God's blessings, even though they weren't Jews, and that God would answer those prayers for them as well. First time in the history of the Jewish people, and first time in the history of Middle Eastern people that we now think of as that part of the world, that had ever been done. To pray to God that God might answer a foreigner's, a stranger's prayer too. Now, we read in the Gospel of Luke from the 7th chapter, just the first 10 verses. Now, in Matthew, there's a section. How many of you remember there's a section in the Gospel of Matthew that is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount? You remember hearing of that anyway. Well, there's a part of the Gospel of Luke that's referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. Now, what they really are, neither of them really happened as a sermon. They're a collection of teachings that everybody agreed Jesus had given to people, and they're kind of all collected together in one part. The one here in Luke is much shorter than the one in Matthew, and today's reading comes right after what is referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion in that town had a slave whom the centurion valued highly, which slave was ill and close to death. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to Jesus, asking Jesus to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "This man is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us," the centurion. And Jesus went with them, but when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to Jesus, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, But only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the centurion, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent to Jesus returned to the centurion's house, they found the slave in good health. Here ends the reading of Scripture. May God grant its meaning to our hearts and our minds. Have you ever been a stranger? Have you ever felt like a stranger? What's it feel like? Uncomfortable, anxious, awkward, lonely? The people here have never been a stranger. Nothing coming from this. It's scary. Okay. How do you know that's how a stranger feels? Because, see, I just asked you if you've ever been a stranger. And you can remember that you think you were and even how you felt. But who taught you that? That that's how a stranger feels. Nobody taught you. Okay. How did you know you were a stranger in those situations? Nobody came up to you? You didn't know people? Okay. People were looking at you but not talking to you. And it made you think that, oh, maybe they're talking about me? Well, if you were to define what it means to be a stranger, what would be your definition? Awkward? Boy, you should see me dance. But that doesn't make me a stranger. The awkward part, you know. But no, Webster's dictionary, what would be your definition like that of a stranger? How do you define a stranger? Pardon? A person not known? Stays to themselves. That's a stranger. Alien. A stranger. Yeah. To whom are these persons strangers, if we're giving them a definition? No, they're strangers to us. Huh. Would you say that a stranger is a person that we don't know? Okay, let me try out this definition for you. A stranger is a person who has never shared a meal at my home. Why don't you like that? You could be Allie just said you can be a stranger in your own home. Ooh. The people sitting next to you they're all kind of they're like this. They're sitting like this and they're looking down at the floor right now. And you know, you're leaning this way. They're all leaning that way now. Okay, but that's an insight. No, I'm suggesting a stranger is a person that's never shared a meal in my home. Why don't you like that? Why don't you like that? Not a requirement for what? Oh, a stranger is the opposite of a friend then. Because you said it's not a requirement for friendliness. It's not a requirement for friendliness in the United States of America. But it is in almost every other country. If you are a friend with someone, inevitably you will eat a meal in their home and they will eat a meal in your home. Not in the United States, because we worship something called individualism. We still remember those words of a mean old guy named Robert Frost, who said, "Fences make good neighbors." How many of you think of that every once in a while? Fences make good neighbors, you know? That's the way we live. It is. Huh? Well, sometimes it works, yeah. They're better neighbors afterward, in our opinion. Look, it's hard for us to understand just how radical that teaching was from the Old Testament I just told you about, when at the dedication of the temple, both the prophet and the king prayed for those foreigners, those strangers who would come to the temple seeking God's help, and please God, give it to them. We don't even know them. They aren't Jews. They aren't religious. They're those people that we've had wars with. But God help them too if they come and ask for it. Wow, a stranger? A foreigner? Wait, that just seems, well, most everybody's like that, so why wouldn't God want to answer? It didn't seem like that. And it didn't seem like that to the people who were watching Jesus and listening to him, watching him go around, coming in the big crowds to listen to his sayings, his teachings. He seemed like a radical new rabbi. And he was suggesting some ways of looking at life and the world that nobody had ever suggested before. And he was healing people that weren't religious. In fact, what did the centurions do? They killed people, or they had people killed because they gave the order. The centurion was the head military guy in the area, and he commanded a lot of soldiers that were in the area. There's many historical books that were written during that time that spoke of how every once in a while, just to remind their people who was boss, the Roman centurions would have the army people go and just slaughter some people. They would do it to Jews while they were having their services. They would just do it to other people who were talking about maybe they didn't like the government as much as they used to and stuff like that. Well, let's just go slaughter them and remind them who's there. The centurion built a synagogue for the Jews in that city, right outside Capernaum. Now, I think that's a story of a politically savvy centurion, if you ask me. I mean, let's not have to kill these people. Let's build them a synagogue, and then they'll always be nice to us. That's what I think. But it doesn't matter what I think. Here's a guy who they had to fear, who comes to Jesus and says, look, my slave is sick, and I really like my slave. Please heal my slave. And Jesus does it. Now, why do you think the centurion said, don't come to the house? Don't come to the house. Well, if you were a Jew of that period and you invited someone to come to your house, you would walk in and you'd know they were a Jew, because there would be certain symbols and everything like that. They would know how to welcome you. Well, the centurion knew that Jews had all those things that were supposed to be done for especially an honored person like Jesus. And the centurion knew it wouldn't be there. I mean, that kind of ruins the story, doesn't it? Well, but that's the truth. You can't, the centurion respected Jesus enough and didn't want to seem disrespectful. The centurion wanted that slave healed. So he said, don't come in the house. Look, I can give orders and things happen. Can't you just give the order and my centurion will be cured? And he was. And Jesus said, I haven't seen faith like that even in my own people. Didn't he? It harkens back to Solomon praying for the foreigners at the temple. Now, I want to go back to suggesting that a useful definition of stranger is a person who's never had a meal with me in my home. Why would I say something like that based upon these scriptures? Why would I? Why do you hate that definition so much? I did it on, I did it on purpose. I didn't think you'd like it. But it gives some thought to the fact that we don't know very much about each other in most cases. One of the first things that I think Diane and I always get asked when we go to somebody's house is, how did you meet? And we have this great true story about a blind date and all this stuff. And so, and we tell them. Why do we get asked that? It's so that people get a better sense of us, huh? The past, the present. Why do you do what you do is another question that we ask people, isn't it? If we want to get to know them. How come you're a teacher? How come you're a doctor? How come you're a nurse? How come? We want to get to feel for them. We want to have a bigger sense of them. But that usually only happens, what? When we spend some of our time with them and they with us. Spend time. Where do you think that phrase came from? I mean, what do we usually think of spending? Money. Because if we spend it, what's the next truth about that money? We don't have it anymore. It's gone. Unless it's a really good retail store, we can't get it back either. Okay? It's gone. We spend it. Did you ever think about your own time, that you're spending it? If you come here on a Thursday, you're spending your time in our food ministry. If you come on a Wednesday afternoon to Cherry Creek Elementary School, you're spending some of the time you have in this lifetime tutoring some children. If you go to somebody's house to have dinner with them, you and they are spending some of the time you've been given on each other. We don't know how much we've been given, do we? We don't know. We just know we got it. We've got it. I want you to think about that when the stranger comes, because strangers are going to come through these doors. They come through sometimes on Sundays. I keep reminding you, when Diane and I first came to this church, to one of the Sunday services, 3 years ago now? It was either July or August of 2013. We really felt like strangers. Well, we were. We didn't know anybody here. Nobody here knew us, but it was obvious that everybody here knew each other, because you're all talking to each other, like we do, because we talk and we know each other, and we hear you talking about stuff you did in high school together. And I remember the sign on the back of the shirt that my wife and kids gave me. It says, "The older I get, the better I was." I didn't know we had so many all-state athletes, for instance, in this congregation. That's what it sounds like when you... Anyway, no, I'm just kidding you now. But seriously, we were strangers, and we left that day as strangers, too. Now, we aren't strangers anymore. We know most of you a lot better than we did. But still, because Christians aren't taught the way Jews were about being hospitable to the strangers, because we don't think of that as a faith practice, to recognize strangers and, what should I call it, unstrange them, we don't think of that as an act of faithfulness. We think of it as whether we're friendly or not. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. The spending of time is an act of faith. The spending of time ought to be really important when we do it, don't you think? When you think about it, I don't get that stuff back. So when the stranger comes, according to the teachings of Old and New Testament, that's an important time. It's one that we need to get good at recognizing and see it as an opportunity to spend some of ourselves so that others might live. Spend some of ourselves so we might be enriched by a stranger who's becoming a friend. Spend some of ourselves so that we know that there should not be any divisions between rich and poor, because there's no such thing as a poor person. There's a real such thing as persons living in poverty, but there's no such thing as a poor person, unless that's what we condemn them to, because we prefer that they remain a stranger. So, I'm not telling you that the definition of a stranger really is a person who's never had a meal at my home. But keep that in your mind, because if they did have a meal at my home, I would have spent time, my time, with and for them, and they would have too. Just a little thought, when will we spend time with a stranger? Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.